Welcome to the second African Archaeology Seminar Lecture of the Michaelmas Term 2020. We are very pleased to welcome Professor Ibrahima Thiaw. Professor Thiaw holds his PhD from Rice University in Texas. He is Associate Professor of Archaeology at the Institut Fondamental d'Afrique Noire at University Cheikh Anta Diop of Dakar, Senegal. He has research interests in the long-term impact of trans-Saharan and Atlantic trade, craft production, culture contact, archaeological study of identity and cultural heritage management. He has conducted research in the Middle and Upper Senegal Valley, with a focus on the Gorée Island and coastal Senegambia. He is presenting in this lecture his recent fieldwork in the Cap Verde Peninsula in coastal Senegal. This work revealed important archaeological and heritage sites that were directly linked to the Atlantic slave trade. He is exploring the way 18th century communities manipulated the landscape to resist to the Wolof warlords and European explorers, and the residual effects of the difficult past in the present. He is also critically examining the recent controversies of the World Heritage Sites of Gorée Island, arguing for breaking away from colonial essentialism, top-bottom approaches, and advocating for more community engagement from archaeologists and heritage professionals. If you enjoyed the presentation and would like to meet and ask questions to the speaker, you are invited to attend our live Q&A session on the 8th of December. You can register by following the link in the video description. Enjoy the lecture and thank you.
I would like to thank the organizers of this presentation, in particular Professor Paul Len of Cambridge, who has invited me to do this presentation. Recent fieldwork in coastal Senegal has revealed important archaeological and heritage sites that were directly linked to Atlantic slavery. The violence of that time ushered Lebu and Safen communities of 18th and 19th centuries Senegal to manipulate the landscape to resist to Wolof warlord and European powers. The residual effect of that difficult past still lingers in the present and are transmitted relationally. Even today, legacies of Atlantic slavery haunt our present, creating in our everyday lives feelings of fear, strength, anguish, grief, and anxiety. The live airing of the killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer on May 25, 2020, rebuked millions of people and has brought the movement of Black Lives Matter to world stage attention, its action being to dismantle racial injustice. While in the massive archives of slavery, the killing of a Black man or woman was nothing new, the global protests and public outrage caused by the killing of George Floyd were unprecedented. The toppling of monuments celebrating slavery or people associated with it, name changing and processes of free memorialization spread globally. Building on that momentum, this presentation is an attempt to interrogate the archaeological record and the heritage landscape of coastal Senegal to reflect on the material manifestation of the sensorial and memorial experience of the Atlantic slave trade. It also reflects on the implication of this global movement for social justice, equity, and reparative history for archaeological practice in Africa. The first section of my presentation reflects on the materialization of sensorial and memorial experiences for recent historical sites. The second, explore the sensorial and memorial experiences of Atlantic slavery in the Dakar and Thiès region through the heritage landscape, oral tradition, and the Maison des Esclaves guest book. The third section revisits two case studies of site renaming controversies in light of the recent social protest. The final section sketch out our initiative to break away with extroverted top-bottom approaches to give voice to local audiences. Atlantic slavery has imprinted deep scars in landscape, architecture, archaeological ruination, material objects, dead bodies, images, texts, and memories. Some of these material objects, landscape features, and settlement strategies were specifically designed to face the fear and anguish caused by enslavement and slave hunting. In this reflection, I'm particularly attentive to the concept of taskscape landscape developed by Ingewold, where place is created through an embodied multisensorial experience. For Ingewold, task is a social practice carried out as part of everyday life activities, and therefore, taskscape is participated in and lived out as a multisensorial experience embodied in social interaction. It is a shared sensual experience that is partially recorded in matter and landscapes through movement and body contact emanating from the events and performances of human actors in a particular environment. The sensorial experience is amenable to archaeological testing through experimental replication, but also through ethnographic and historical information. In the case of coastal Senegal, there is a great deal of historical and ethnographic information to help us disentangle the complex set of sensual experiences from domestic, symbolic to spiritual practices. Almost 20 years ago, I was struck by how Senegalese people appropriated or contested the recent historical past, while showing little affect to the most remote past that was rarely claimed or contested. Ever since, I struggled to comprehend what was it in that recent historical past that drew so vividly our interest and our senses. Ironically, most, if not all, of the recent historical sites in question were associated either with Atlantic slavery or colonial history. The violence and dehumanization of non-Western orders, including Black bodies, were found on asymmetric power relations that were rooted in European ideologies of knowledge production. Slavery-related archaeological sites, the built environment, and landscape features are potential record of that central political economy of violence. For Navarro Yasmin, working in Cyprus, for instance, ruination or the material remains or artifacts of destructions are not only records of violation, but also reflect the subjectivities and residual affect that linger like a hangover. They appear then as the ultimate and intimate material manifestation of the abject, and as such exude a sentiment of defilement. Both the abject and the commendable are situated within the same social order where each generates its own subjectivities. Subjects who made them and who live in their midst are also project their subjectivities and affectivities onto them. Hence, both the ruins and the people who interact with them produce and transmit affect relationally. In Western Senegal, the World Heritage Site of Gorée Island, the World Heritage Site of the Island largely dominate historical debate on Atlantic slavery. This does not, however, do justice to the rich cultural heritage of many communities whose existence was profoundly shaped by Atlantic slavery. Our recent survey in the Cap Verde Peninsula that encompassed part of the Dakar and Chess region, but also that is the adjacent mainland around Gorée Island, has revealed a rich landscape of settlement and memorial sites that yield critical insight on the sensorial experience of Atlantic slavery. The fragmentation of political space in Western Senegal is largely linked to the advent of European commerce in the 15th century and the rise of small-scale polities whose economy was almost exclusively oriented toward the Atlantic. In the same time, we see the emergence of decentralized communities opposing enslavement and promoting alternative models of political sovereignty that rejected social stratification and aristocratic rule. As you can see in this map, Abe Bouala talked in the 19th century of two republics that existed in the 18th century at the head of the Atlantic slave trade in this region. The Lebu Republic of the Cap Verde Peninsula and the Safen, or the non-republic as he called it, were important social formation in the region by the 18th century. Racialization and ethnicization created relations of mistrust among coastal polities, and Wolof speakers, for instance, use the ethnonym non, which translates as the enemy in the Wolof language, to designate Safen people, which resulted, of course, in their hunting and enslavement. Safen communities strategically responded by establishing their settlement in landscape surrounded by hills and escarpment that were further camouflaged in heavily vegetated areas. One such site was identified 2.5 kilometers east of the Atlantic shores. And this is the site of Jalau that we identified during our survey. Today, descendant communities continue to visit this site to seek protection from the ancestors, particularly at this baobab. In the 18th century, the Lebu built also several strongholds or walls to protect themselves from the Wolof cavalry. And this is one of those that were identified actually in the mid-20th century by Raymond Money. In addition to this built environment, a number of natural features were used as religious sites to deter slave trading. This include a number of religious sites as this rock outcropping on the shores of the Atlantic near Tubab Jalao that is known as Kher Bany Damel, which literally means in Wolof, the rock that hates the Damel, who was the paramount chief of the kingdom of Kajor. According to oral tradition, any Damel, and by extension, any holder of monarchic or aristocratic authority, seeing that rock would absolutely step down. And today, even today, many continue to believe that this prescription still applies to the present, and Senegalese presidents are advised not to see that rock, particularly when seeking a second term. Another important rock outcropping that is part of this important central heritage is Yambi, that allegedly hosts bees' nests that represent a mythical and mystical army that protects the settlement against slave hunters and against all harms. Both Serer Safen and Lebu speakers share this heritage of resistance. Other religious sites were used to face the fear and anguish, and also to conjure all harms against the community. This includes practices of African religions, sometimes neatly combined with Islamic rituals and prayers, as is shown here in this site known as Ten Mam Jari in Yoff. Now let me examine the residual sensual experience as expressed in the Maison des Esclaves guestbook that deals more closely with another category of stakeholders, the Afro-American diaspora. Using the entries of the guestbook of the Maison des Esclaves, we can explore the sensual memories of the Atlantic slave trade. For many Afro-descendant visitors, Gorée and its Maison des Esclaves were central to the identity of the African diaspora. It is there that their distinct identity as a people was forged through the physical and psychological violence inflicted to enslaved Black bodies. The processes of identity formation were painful, as the enslaved were subject to hazing, torture, and were forcefully shipped to the Americas. As one visitor pointed out, quote, "The soul has but one home and it always returns. This is the nature of all voyages," end of quote. Thus, for many visitors from the African diaspora, the tour to Gorée Island was first and before all to pay respect to the suffering of the ancestors at these sites of separation, where the umbilical cord with Mother Africa was ruptured, which sanctified those places. As one visitor put it, quote, "My soul has been touched by the presence of my ancestors," end of quote. Another one wrote, quote, the spirits are alive in this place. I hear the cries of my ancestors," end of quote. In revisiting that painful experience, the visitor later appreciate the strength, tenaciousness, and survival skills of their ancestors who paved the way for them. The tour is too often very emotional, as the one visitor pointed out. Quote, "Words cannot begin to describe my feelings. As I walk, excuse me, as I walk through the rooms, especially the room for the young boys, I felt the pain and the torture of being crowded and unable to breathe or move, as it brought tears I felt the pain and torture of being crowded and unable to breathe or move, and it brought tears to my eyes. I swept for my ancestors, for my people, but tears cannot erase the past," end of quote. In large numbers of entries in the guest book, the site is claimed as home and the visitor is back to regain African identity and culture. Return to Gorée Island is then seen as a step in a long process of struggle, resistance, and ultimately success, as the descendant of the enslaved freely came back to this imagined and symbolic homeland that they claim as their own. To highlight that resilience, one visitor had it that, quote, "They took us out of our country, but they can never take our country, our culture, ourselves out of us," end of quote. Clearly, this is to reassess the Africanity of the African diaspora. The lingering effect of the Atlantic experience are for African and people of African descent an invaluable resource to resist alienation and misrepresentation, and call for alternative epistemologies and ontologies that break with parameters of inequity and injustice imposed upon them by slavery and colonization. This is reflected, for instance, in two recent cases of the off-site naming in the study area. Naming is not simply a symbolic utterance. To give a name to a place is also beyond the referential act of naming, a decision of great cultural significance that is embedded in identity and memory politics with immense consequences. It can be a highly symbolic act, either in defiance or in commemoration of a given past. As such, naming may easily result in socio-political confrontation. This was particularly true when it came to naming a site, Place de l'Europe. Naming a site, Place de l'Europe, in Gorée Island on May 9th, 2018. The different protagonists clash over international aid, the politics of memory and identity, and the enduring legacies of transatlantic slavery and colonization in the present. For many, this was an insidious and fortunate enterprise of rememorization, of resymbolization of space. It was an initiative to redesign a place to meet the taste and standard of a Europeanized landscape and was funded with euros from the European Union. While the European role in the transatlantic slave trade has long been decried, the fact of the matter is that Europe, through Euro-aid, continues to shape Atlantic landscape and memorialization processes in Africa. The decision of naming a site, Place de l'Europe, was challenged because it was unilateral. It was neither inclusive nor consultative or participatory. Therefore, multiple stakeholders contested it. The city of Gorée and Senegalese heritage official attempt to resist to the wide public disapprobation, but would not stand the global outcry following the killing of George Floyd, during which the Place de l'Europe in Gorée Island was renamed Place de la Liberté, or Place of Liberty. Another divisive site naming also caught our attention in 2018. The lack of community engagement and the interventionism of public authorities generally carry the seeds of conflicts between and within communities. Giving a place name is primarily for the purpose of localization and orientation. However, it can also be imbued with significance in relation to a given heritage, a history, or a specific identity. Vertical choices by public authorities and multinational companies which decide alone without consulting local communities can be detrimental to communities' cohesion, peace, and stability. Recently, the naming of the site of the new port of Dakar was a source of inter-community division to which community engagement and archaeology offered credible solution. And you can see the site here in that map. We interviewed nearly 300 people and surveyed the historic villages, collecting ethnographic data on settlement history and tangible as well as intangible heritage. From that work, it appeared that there was a shared history and a strong sense of belonging to an old settlement known as Jankap, which encompassed one of the archaeological sites we identified on the Atlantic shores that you can see here. And we did a number of consultation to collect evidence on linkage of communities with this site. The site was abandoned in the first quarter of the 20th century as a result of a plague outbreak. But the site name is Jankop, and it defined an economic, social, and emotional space, as well as a religious ground for most communities in the project area. And this could be used to neutralize emerging inter-community tension born out of the site naming. And the picture you see on the back of that slide is a mosque, and the site is probably dated to the 19th century, and the mosque probably as well. And it is associated allegedly to one of Senegalese cleric Sheikh Omar, who resisted to the French. These multiple conflicts and social unrest concerning heritage are used as a pretext to develop alternative practices that are more oriented toward the demands and needs of local audiences. African archaeology is the produce of an intellectual tradition that is rooted in imperial and liberal European history. Its workbench of concept, modus operandi, languages, and dissemination and consumption practices are extroverted and largely unintelligible at the local level, where it operates in Africa. Over the past years, we have been struggling to avoid reproducing these concepts and practices in order to make archaeology more relevant to the worldview, needs, and concerns of the communities where we've been working. We designed constructive strategies that sought to cultivate new archaeological practice that blend more coherently with local worldviews of what relevant historical data, meaning making and dissemination strategy should be. This was done through community engagement and through involving a griot and a rap musician in the archaeological process. And as you can see here, we are engaging communities to really the archaeological process, bringing the griot and the rapper to help us tell in their own words, using their own art and through performance, but informed by the archaeological record as well to tell the narrative of the site and discuss with communities. Just to illustrate that, I'm now going to be sharing the performance of the rap artist who was working with us, whose artist nickname is I'm the Best, but his real name is Amadou So. So now I will be sharing very quickly that that video.
bëgg sa tey leer fàttalikul démb ku bañ sa xeet xeeb sa bopp soppalikul dëmb xam-xam du réer fi muy mujje mooy dëgg ëllëg du añ du reer waaye daa mëta sédd tey la neex ñu xëccoo suufaay bu ñu kenn tànkal Lebu ye moom Dakaaru ku fi am mètre carré santal lépp ngi doore si Jalaaw village bu ndaw bu ne si digg pax montagne yi wër ko ki ko sanc mooy ci laaw dinaa la wax lu tax mu migré ba pes ci jël ko feebar bi def ravage dëkk bi tas nit ñi daw ñi ëpp si ñoom dem géej ñi ci des wutali penk mbayaar ku bi sam géej sit baa ngi noonu protégé par les massifs de Diass soo bëggee am lu gën a leer demal région de Thiès dig fa gis ay lomb ba mel yu mel ni danj tojitu ndaay wër ko tey li si ëpp dëkkuwaayu aéroport bi jël ko boo xamul fi nga jëm dellu fi nga jóge woon Thiès di tekki jaar sancaanu séeréer noon vestige yaa ngi fa ni gàññ les plateaux de Thiès du ma xuus si alum kaañ sinon xol yi fees sinon xol yi fees sinon xol yi fees sinon xol yi fees fees yàgg bawul dara sant dëkkul fenn li waral kalante bi firndeel maam yi nekkoon teen liggéey Sénégal ba benn deret di daw seen yaram séeréer di Lebu ñoo bokk benn maam ci law seen ku nekk ak cosaanam ku nekk ak sa feem waaye aada yi ngay gis ci Lebu gi fekk ko Safen ceddo piir saafi bàyyee ko ba Fuuta islam ñëw mu bañ a tuub ñu andil ko fa guuta am ñu naan sax dëkku fa dégg naa sax ñu naan yàgg na Fuuta Tooro di séeréer migré di ñëw àndoon naa ak dogo ay nit yu doon tabax ndaa ak ay fort zoro raas yaa ngi dogo di montagne buñ ko duppee ne woon fabrique céramique ba yaa di tekki mbaar di ndaa histoire wasaru jaara nit histoire wasaru jaara nit histoire wasaru jaara nit en 1444 tubaab bi ñëw Jalaaw Denis Diaz ak ci law moo waral tubaab Jalaaw El Hadj Omar Fouti jaar fa bi muy def ci xaat fekk askan bu mar naan di dund lu xaat jubloo leen def fa jaaka gasaale ay teen ndox mu neex di bala si géej gi li rek doy na keem mystique bee ma yéem seen mystique bee ma yéem lu tax ba tey ji président du nangoo romb yéen kan mooy Ali Coom ak lu waral mbañ dameel question yu bëri réponse yaa ngi neraw biir ba meel limite tradition orale yi di ñu gën a sànk nañu dolli sant am nañ archéologie yuri ka tàmbali geesu demb ba sànk mel ni borom ñeenti tànk toog ci borom ñeenti tànk di cob borom ñeenti tànk yuri ka tàmbali geesu demb ba sànk mel ni borom ñeenti tànk toog ci borom ñeenti tànk di cob borom ñeenti tànk
Archaeology has always been attentive to social movement, many of which contributing to reconfigure its paradigm. The current moment questioned Western epistemology, privilege, and called for reparative history to attend to the demands and aspirations of historically dehumanized and disenfranchised Black bodies and voices. The alternative possibilities sketched out here are part of a strategy to cultivate a Senegalese teranga aesthetics in the practice of archaeology at home to meet local demand and worldview. And teranga aesthetic is a very known Senegalese form of hospitality, but also of social interaction and a worldview and a way of being. Building on our past sensorial and memorial experience that is recorded in matter, I argue that our world, be it global, is made of a plethora of cultural truth and political ideas that challenge the paradigm of abstract universalism and create space for differences. Excuse me. Reparative justice is always an unfinished business, and for it to take place, we must place our emphasis on connectivity, compensation, repair, and restoration of balance to break with Western epistemic privilege and its cosmopolitan pretension that historically stifle other ways and possibilities. Our effort for transformative practice seek to instigate change and redirect our goals, audience, and approach, and would ineluctably open new opportunities of growth for archaeology. Thank you for your kind attention.